Jamal Washington was just finishing his long shift at the diner. The clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as he drove through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The air outside was cool, and his favorite jazz playlist played softly in the background. All he could think about was getting home, taking off his shoes, and sinking into his bed. Out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights lit up his rearview mirror. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Confused, he glanced at his speedometer. It was well below the limit. He hadn't run a stop sign or done anything unusual. Yet the police cruiser behind him signaled for him to pull over. He pulled his car to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Stay calm," he told himself, taking a deep breath. He rolled down his window as the officer approached. A tall white officer with a serious expression leaned down to meet Jamal's eyes. "License and registration," the officer said in a firm voice, without offering a reason for the stop. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, trying to keep his tone calm. He reached slowly for his glove compartment, pulling out the documents the officer had asked for. As he handed them over, he asked politely, "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took the documents, glanced at them briefly, and said, "Your car matches the description of a vehicle involved in a robbery nearby." Jamal's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A robbery?" he repeated. "Officer, I just left work not 10 minutes ago. I haven't been anywhere else." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as if assessing Jamal's response. "Where do you work?" he asked, his tone sharp. "At the 24/7 diner on Maple Street. I can show you my employee ID if that helps," Jamal offered, trying his best to cooperate. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out his work badge, holding it up for the officer to see. The officer stared at the badge for a moment before looking back at Jamal. His expression remained hard to read. "Wait here," he said gruffly, turning back to his patrol car with Jamal's documents in hand. As Jamal sat there waiting, he couldn't shake the growing feeling of unease. The street was empty, except for the faint glow of a street lamp nearby. He noticed a person on the sidewalk a few yards away, holding up their phone, seemingly recording the interaction. Jamal didn't know whether to feel relieved or more nervous. A second police car arrived, its lights flashing brightly as it parked behind the first. Jamal felt his chest tighten. Two officers got out, one heading straight for the other car, while the second began shining a flashlight into Jamal's windows. The questions in his mind only grew louder. What was going on? And why did it feel like something much bigger than a traffic stop was unfolding? The tension in the air was almost tangible. Jamal gripped the steering wheel again, praying this would end soon. Jamal tried to steady his breathing as he watched the second officer approach his car. The flashlight beam danced across his face and inside the vehicle, making him squint. The officer didn't say a word, just looked through the windows as if searching for something suspicious. "Is everything okay, officer?" Jamal asked, his voice calm but with a hint of worry. The first officer, Officer Bradley, returned from his patrol car holding Jamal's license and registration. His expression was hard, and his tone was sharper this time. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" he asked abruptly. Jamal blinked, taken aback. "No, sir. I don't carry weapons." "Are you sure about that?" Bradley pressed, leaning closer to the window. His eyes were intense, as though he was expecting Jamal to lie. "Yes, I'm sure," Jamal replied, keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel where they could be seen. "You're welcome to check, but I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Bradley's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your car matches the description of a vehicle used in a robbery earlier tonight. Same color, same make." Jamal's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer, I promise you, I've been at work all evening. I just clocked out. If you call my manager, they can confirm that." Bradley didn't seem convinced. "We'll see about that," he muttered, stepping back to confer with the other officer. The second officer, who Jamal overheard being called Officer Daniels, gave a skeptical glance at Bradley. They exchanged a few words, but Jamal couldn't make out what they were saying. Meanwhile, the bystander who had been recording moved a little closer, staying on the sidewalk but angling their phone to capture the scene. Jamal noticed them out of the corner of his eye, and for a brief moment, he felt both thankful and nervous. If this situation went sideways, at least there would be evidence of what really happened. Bradley returned to the car window, his expression even more stern. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Jamal hesitated. "Is that necessary, officer? I haven't done anything wrong, and you said you're still verifying my information." Bradley's tone grew harsher. "Step out of the car now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jamal nodded slowly, unbuckling his seatbelt and pushing the door open. He made sure to keep his hands visible at all times. The cool night air hit him as he stepped out onto the pavement. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car," Bradley instructed. Jamal complied, feeling his pulse quicken. He could hear the murmurs of the bystander nearby, and though he couldn't make out their words, the recording continued. "Is this really necessary?" Jamal asked softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll decide what's necessary," Bradley replied coldly. Jamal's mind raced. What had started as a simple stop now felt like something much bigger, something much more dangerous. Jamal stood by his car, his hands resting on the roof just as Officer Bradley had instructed. The cool night air brushed against his skin, but he hardly noticed it over the pounding of his heart. His thoughts raced as he tried to figure out why things had escalated so quickly. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the tension in the air made it hard to stay calm. Behind him, Officer Daniels was speaking quietly with Bradley. Their words were too low for Jamal to hear, but Daniels seemed to be questioning Bradley's decisions. Jamal glanced back slightly, only to hear Bradley snap, "Keep your eyes forward." Jamal quickly obeyed, focusing on keeping himself as calm as possible. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the bystander, a woman holding her phone, still recording. She stepped closer to the scene, careful to stay on the sidewalk, but making her presence known. Jamal silently appreciated her courage, though he couldn't help but feel a little exposed. A second officer from the newly arrived patrol car walked up to Bradley and Daniels, holding a tablet. His plates came back clean, the officer informed them. No reports of stolen vehicles, and no criminal record. Daniels gave Bradley a pointed look. "Maybe we should let him go. Everything's checking out so far." Bradley, however, seemed determined. "That doesn't mean he's not hiding something. The car matches the description. We need to be thorough." Jamal overheard their exchange and felt a flicker of hope at Daniels's words, but it quickly faded as Bradley approached him again. "I'm going to search your car," Bradley said firmly. Jamal frowned, his hand still on the roof of the vehicle. "Officer, with all due respect, I don't consent to a search. I've done nothing wrong, and I've already told you where I've been tonight." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." At that moment, the bystander spoke up, her voice strong and clear. "Officer, you're on camera," she said. "You have no reason to search his car if you don't have probable cause. Everything he's told you checks out." Bradley turned to her, his expression hard. "Ma'am, stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, it concerns all of us," the woman shot back, lifting her phone higher. "He has rights, and you know it." Jamal couldn't help but feel a spark of gratitude for the stranger. Her presence seemed to shift the atmosphere. Officer Daniels, clearly uncomfortable, stepped forward. "Bradley, maybe we should call this in before taking any further steps. We don't want to make a mistake here." For the first time, Bradley hesitated. Jamal could see the frustration in his expression as he stepped back, clearly weighing his options. The situation felt like it was teetering on the edge of something significant. Jamal stayed silent, knowing that any wrong move could change everything. The night was far from over, but at least for now, someone was standing by his side. Jamal stood by his car, his heart pounding as he watched the officers argue among themselves. The bystanders' words seemed to have caused a ripple in the tense situation. Officer Daniels appeared uneasy, while Officer Bradley's frustration was growing more evident. Jamal, still standing with his hands on the car, tried to steady his breathing and remain calm. "Look," Daniels said to Bradley, his voice firmer this time. "We've got no concrete evidence. His plates are clean, his record is spotless, and everything he said checks out. We're crossing a line here." Bradley clenched his jaw. "The car matches the description, and that's enough reason to be suspicious. I'm just doing my job." "But there's a difference between doing your job and going too far," Daniels countered, glancing toward the bystander. "People are watching. This doesn't look good." Jamal listened silently, his chest tightening with every word. He knew Daniels was trying to de-escalate the situation, but Bradley wasn't backing down. The tension between the officers was almost as thick as the tension Jamal felt in his chest. The bystander, still recording, decided to speak up again. "Officers, this man clearly hasn't done anything wrong. You're holding him here for no reason, and everyone can see that. Let him go." Bradley shot her a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Jamal. "Step away from the car," he ordered, his tone clipped. Jamal did as he was told, his hands still visible. "What's happening now, officer?" he asked, doing his best to keep his voice steady. Bradley didn't answer. Instead, Daniels stepped in, his expression calm but serious. "We're going to verify a few more details, but if everything checks out, you'll be free to go," he said, shooting a glance at Bradley. Jamal nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate that." As Daniels walked back to his patrol car, Bradley stayed behind, his piercing gaze fixed on Jamal. It felt as though he was searching for something, anything, that might justify his suspicions. But Jamal stood firm, meeting the officer's eyes without wavering. He knew he had nothing to hide. Moments later, Daniels returned, holding his radio. "Dispatch confirmed there's no link between this vehicle and the robbery report," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's a different car, Officer Bradley. Same color, but the make and model don't match." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let it show. He stayed quiet, waiting to see what Bradley would do next. Bradley's face tightened, his frustration evident. "Fine," he muttered. "You're free to go." Jamal's heart soared, but he kept his composure. "Thank you, officer," he said politely, taking his license and registration back from Bradley's hand. As Jamal climbed back into his car, the bystander called out, "Good for you, man. Stay strong." He gave her a small nod of gratitude before starting the engine. As he drove away, he couldn't help but reflect on how close this had been to going wrong, and how important it was to have someone watching out for him. As Jamal's car slowly rolled away from the scene, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The flashing lights of the police cruisers were still behind him, but now there was a sense of relief. He had been let go, but the situation had left him shaken. His mind replayed the tense moments, questioning how things could have turned out differently. He glanced to his right as he drove, seeing the woman who had been recording the entire interaction. She stood on the sidewalk, her phone still in hand, her face serious but compassionate. Jamal had noticed her before, standing a few yards away, holding up her phone like a silent witness to the scene. Jamal pulled over to the side of the road, his hands still slightly trembling. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, making his way back toward her. He wanted to thank her, but he wasn't sure what to say. As he approached, the woman turned to face him, her expression warm but firm. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentle yet determined. Jamal nodded, offering a faint smile. "Yeah, I'm good now. Just shaken up a bit." She gave him an understanding look. "I saw what happened back there. You did the right thing by standing your ground." Jamal looked at her, slightly surprised. "I wasn't sure what else to do. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but the way they were talking, It felt like they were looking for a reason to make something out of nothing. She nodded in agreement. I saw that too. That's why I started recording. It wasn't right what they were doing. Jamal felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. I really appreciate you stepping in. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up. The woman shrugged. It's not just about you. It's about all of us. We have to look out for each other, especially in situations like this. She hesitated for a moment before adding, I don't know what would have happened if nobody had been watching. Jamal was quiet for a moment, reflecting on her words. The situation could have easily gone in a completely different direction if she hadn't been there to capture it. It made him think about how important it was for people to stand up, even in small ways, when something didn't feel right. I'm Samantha, by the way, she said, extending her hand. Jamal, he replied, shaking her hand. Thanks again, Samantha. No problem, she said with a smile. It's the least I could do. Jamal stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the evening slowly lift off his shoulders. For the first time since the stop, he felt like he wasn't alone. He'd had a stranger's help in his moment of need, someone who had been watching out for him and others like him. Well, I should probably get going, Samantha said after a moment, tucking her phone into her bag. But take care, Jamal. Stay safe. Yeah, Jamal said, his voice filled with sincerity. You too. As he got back into his car, he felt a little lighter. It wasn't just the relief of being free to go. It was the feeling of having someone on his side. A small moment of support had made a world of difference, and it reminded him that sometimes standing up for what's right can make all the difference. As Jamal drove away from the scene, the weight of the night still lingered in the pit of his stomach. Though he was free to go, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the quiet streets, the events of the evening running through his mind over and over. What if things had gone differently? What if he hadn't known his rights? What if the bystander hadn't been there to record? His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. He reached over and picked it up, seeing a text from his sister. You okay? Saw the post online. What happened? He quickly typed back. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a crazy stop, but I'm good now. As he sent the message, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. It was from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment but decided to answer. Hello. Is this Jamal Washington? The voice on the other end sounded professional but friendly. Yes, speaking. Hi, Jamal. My name is Officer Daniels. I'm calling about the traffic stop earlier tonight. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect from this call. Had something gone wrong after all? Is everything all right, officer? Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice calm. I just wanted to reach out personally to apologize for the situation tonight, Officer Daniels said. I've been reviewing the incident, and I realize now that we should have handled things differently. Jamal was taken aback. He hadn't expected an apology. I appreciate that, officer, he replied carefully. But honestly, I'm just glad it's over. I understand, Daniels said, but I wanted you to know that we're looking into this. Officer Bradley, the one who pulled you over, was a little too focused on suspicion without proper cause. He's being reviewed as part of our internal process. I just thought you should know that. Jamal felt a mix of emotions. Relief washed over him, but there was also a feeling of disbelief. He hadn't expected to hear anything like this. I didn't know what to think back there. It felt like I was being targeted for no reason. You weren't, Daniels said firmly. You did nothing wrong. Bradley got fixated on the wrong idea, and I should have stepped in earlier. I'm sorry it took this long to clear things up. If you feel uncomfortable or unsafe in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. We take this seriously. Jamal stayed silent for a moment, processing the officer's words. It wasn't easy for him to feel trust in the system after everything he'd just gone through. But hearing this apology, genuine and without excuses, was a step forward. Thank you for calling. Jamal said quietly. "I just want to move on from this, but it's good to know someone's looking into it." "I'll keep you updated, Jamal," Officer Daniels said. "And again, I'm really sorry for what happened tonight." As Jamal hung up the phone, a heavy sigh escaped his lips. The night had taken an unexpected turn, but the call gave him a sense of closure. It wasn't over yet. There would be more to come, but for the first time in hours, he felt like something positive might come from this whole experience. Maybe this was the beginning of change, one small step at a time. The next morning, Jamal couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. He had spent the night thinking about everything that had happened. It wasn't just the traffic stop itself that weighed on him, but the way it had made him feel, like he was somehow guilty, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. The fear of being misunderstood, or worse, treated unfairly, still lingered in his mind. But now, there was something else. The phone call from Officer Daniels gave him a small sense of hope. Jamal sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee as the morning sun streamed through the window. He had tried to relax, but the events of the night before kept replaying in his mind. He'd heard stories of people facing unjust treatment, but this time, it had been him. The thought made his stomach tighten. As he turned on the news, a familiar face appeared on the screen. Officer Daniels. The headline read, "Local officer addresses recent traffic stop controversy." Jamal listened closely as Daniels spoke, his voice calm but serious. "I'm fully aware that an unfortunate incident occurred last night. My department is looking into the actions of Officer Bradley, and we are committed to making sure that everyone is treated with respect and fairness. No one should feel unsafe or unfairly targeted, especially during routine interactions with law enforcement." Jamal sat back in his chair, hearing the officer's words with a sense of disbelief. It was one thing to hear an apology over the phone, but hearing it publicly, especially from someone in charge, felt different. It made him feel like maybe, just maybe, things could improve. Maybe people could start to feel like they had a voice in situations like this. Later that day, Jamal received another call, this time from his sister. She had seen the news segment and wanted to check in. "Did you hear Officer Daniels?" she asked. "He said they're looking into everything." "That's huge, right?" Jamal nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, it is. I didn't expect that." "You should feel proud," she said, her voice full of encouragement. "You stood up for yourself, and now people are listening." Jamal couldn't help but smile at her words. It hadn't felt like standing up for himself at the time. It had just felt like doing what was right. But hearing her say it that way made him realize something important. He hadn't backed down, and because of that, things were changing. Maybe it wasn't a huge change, but it was a start. As the day went on, Jamal found himself feeling a little lighter. He thought about the way he had handled the situation, staying calm and respectful, even when the officers hadn't given him the same treatment at first. He realized that standing his ground, in a respectful way, had made a difference. Jamal knew that not every encounter would be like this one. Not every officer would apologize or take responsibility. But maybe, just maybe, he had started something. It was a small victory, but it mattered. He went to bed that night with a feeling he hadn't expected to have. Hope. It wasn't a perfect world, but as he lay there in the quiet of his room, he realized that sometimes change started with a single moment. One person doing what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. The days that followed were filled with news reports, social media posts, and conversations about the incident that Jamal had experienced. His phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls from friends, family, and even some people he didn't know. Everyone had seen the video that the bystander had recorded, and the story quickly went viral. It was everywhere, on news sites, social media feeds, and even the local newspaper. At first, Jamal felt a bit overwhelmed. He never expected something as simple as a routine traffic stop to become such a big deal. But as the days passed, he began to see something powerful unfold. People were talking, really talking, about racial profiling and police accountability. They were sharing their own stories and offering support. It was like the incident had opened up a conversation that had been waiting to happen. One evening, as Jamal sat at home, scrolling through his phone, he noticed a post from the bystander. Samantha, the woman who had recorded the incident. She had written a message about the importance of speaking up when things aren't right. Her words resonated with him, and he decided to reach out. He typed out a message. "Hey Samantha, just wanted to say thank you again for everything. Your courage really helped me out that night. I saw your post, and it's amazing to see how many people are starting to listen." A few minutes later, his phone buzzed with a response. "No problem at all, Jamal. I'm just glad it made a difference. People need to hear these stories so they can understand what's really going on." Jamal smiled as he read her reply. It felt good to know that the small act of standing up, of simply saying something when it wasn't easy, could make such a big impact. But he knew it wasn't just about the video or the attention it had brought. It was about the change that was starting to take place, even if it was only a small part of the larger picture. A few days later, Jamal received another unexpected call. This time, it was from the local news station. They wanted to interview him about the incident and the ongoing conversations about police practices. Jamal wasn't sure what to expect, but he agreed to speak on camera. The interview was simple. The reporter asked about his experience during the traffic stop, how he felt, and what he hoped would come from it. Jamal spoke honestly about his feelings, how scared and confused he had felt, how relieved he was when he was finally allowed to go, and how grateful he was that Samantha had been there to witness the whole thing. He also talked about how he hoped the incident would spark change in the way people were treated by the police. When the interview aired, it was clear that Jamal's story had struck a chord with many people. It wasn't just his experience. It was the experience of so many others who had felt the same way. Jamal's words were not just his own. They echoed the voices of countless people who had been misunderstood or unfairly targeted. His story was becoming part of a larger conversation, one that was just beginning. As Jamal sat back that evening, watching the reactions unfold, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He had stood up for himself when it mattered, and now others were starting to listen. Change was slow, but it was happening, and for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like things could get better. Weeks passed, but the impact of Jamal's experience continued to ripple through the community. News outlets had covered the story extensively, and social media posts kept spreading, keeping the conversation alive. The attention had started as something that made Jamal uncomfortable, but it quickly grew into something more powerful than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about his individual experience anymore. It had become a conversation about accountability, fairness, and the need for change in law enforcement practices. Jamal had never wanted attention or recognition. All he had wanted was to be treated fairly and with respect. But as the days went by, he started to understand the larger significance of what had happened. He had become part of a much bigger movement, one that was challenging the system and asking for better treatment of people, regardless of their background. One evening, as Jamal sat on his porch reflecting, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Officer Daniels, the officer who had called to apologize after the incident. "Hi Jamal, I just wanted to update you on what's happening. The department has made some changes based on the conversation sparked by your case. We're launching an internal review and are offering additional training to officers on handling stops in a fair and unbiased way. We're also looking into increasing community outreach to improve relations between officers and the people we serve. I just wanted you to know that your experience has made a difference." Jamal sat there for a moment, stunned. It wasn't every day that someone took responsibility, let alone made actual changes. The sincerity in Officer Daniels' message gave Jamal hope. He had no illusions that everything would be perfect from now on, but knowing that his story had sparked real change was a step in the right direction. A few days later, Jamal was invited to speak at a local community meeting. The topic was building stronger community police relationships, and the organizers wanted to hear his perspective on the events of that night. Jamal was nervous. He had never spoken in front of a large group before, but he knew this was an opportunity to continue the conversation. He wanted to share his experience and what he had learned through it all. When the night of the meeting arrived, Jamal stood in front of the room filled with local residents, some familiar, some strangers. He felt the weight of his words, knowing they could inspire change or simply be lost in the noise. But he began to speak anyway. "I wasn't looking for trouble," Jamal started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was just a regular guy on his way home. But that night, I learned something. I learned how important it is to stay calm, to know your rights, and to speak up when something doesn't feel right." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people listening. "But more than that, I learned how much we need to be able to trust each other. We need to trust our police officers, and they need to trust us. We need to see each other as human beings, not just as labels or stereotypes." As Jamal finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then, slowly, people began to nod, and a few started clapping. It wasn't a big applause, but it was enough. Jamal knew that his words had been heard. As he left the meeting that night, Jamal felt lighter than he had in weeks. The struggle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like real change was possible. It started with one small moment, one story, and now it was growing into something much larger. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he would keep fighting for what was right, and he wouldn't be doing it alone.